If you'd like to be with us on the air today, the number again to call is 844-484-5737. Our first caller today is Mike, calling from Hawaii. Hi, Mike. Welcome to The Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Hi, Steve. There's a social media guy that I follow, and I really respect him in a lot of ways, but he just kind of came out of the closet recently, is quoting, quote, red pilling on a certain subject, which seems, I heard somebody years ago bring this up to me, but seems to be saying that Paul's writings should not be included in the New Testament, that he had a lot of disagreement with some of the other apostles, and that there's question to that, and that once you remove that and start reading it that way, then things start to take a very different appearance in regards to how things work. And I was just wondering if you're familiar with this, where it came from, what it's all about, and what the major, other than, some of the other ones, what the major flaws are with that concept, what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, there's always been critics of Paul, and there's been a revival of criticism of Paul in modern times simply because of the internet. The internet has allowed every kind of nutcase critic of the Bible to get a platform and get a following and so forth. However, I'd love to debate that person about this, because Paul was an apostle of Christ. How do I know this? Because Christ called him and made him an apostle. He's the only one of the apostles who was called by Christ after Christ ascended into heaven, but Christ appeared to him, blinded him. Then, he got converted, and he got filled with the Spirit, and then he had all the apostolic signs, miracles and so forth that the other apostles did. He had been an enemy of the church before that, and so the original apostles did not trust him initially, but that didn't last long. They soon did come to trust him, and then they even recommended him. They sent, when he went out from the Jerusalem Council, they wrote a letter recommending him and Barnabas, saying that these men have hazarded their lives for the gospel's sake. These are our partners here. Peter himself, writing in 2 Peter chapter 3, spoke of all of Paul's writings as if they were scripture. He said that, our beloved brother Paul, in all his letters, speaks of these things in which those who are, I think he said, unlearned and, unstable men, they corrupt them, they twist them as they do the other scriptures. So Peter says, these people, they misuse the letters of Paul just like they do the rest of the scriptures, which sounds like Peter's putting Paul kind of on the level of scripture. But whether Peter did or not, Jesus did. Jesus called him to be an apostle. The same reason we have Peter's letters or John's letters is because they were apostles. And we have Paul's letters. He's an apostle too. Now, if someone says, well, we shouldn't have them because he disagreed with the other apostles, well, I don't think he disagreed with them for very long. They came around. In the initial stages of his ministry, he was more radical than they were. They were Jewish apostles who were ministering in Jerusalem, in the Jewish society. And they were more or less going along with Jewish customs and so forth, because all of their converts were Jewish. And, there was no controversy over doing Jewish things. Now, when Paul was called by Christ to go to the Gentiles, he began to minister to people, and Gentiles would be converted who were not circumcised, who were not Jewish, who were not, accustomed to Jewish ways. And the question came up between Paul and the other apostles as to whether Paul is negligent in not requiring his Gentile converts to become Jewish. Because in Jerusalem, all the converts to Christianity were Jewish. And they all kind of were Jewish in culture. They were all circumcised. They were all temple observant. And these Gentiles in other countries where Paul was evangelizing, they weren't circumcised. They weren't Jewish, and they weren't temple observant. So this was a question that rose between Paul and the others, and they had a big conference about it in Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas on the one side, and Peter and James and John and the apostles on the other, and they hashed it out for a period of time, and then it was finally decided and by the apostles in Jerusalem that Paul and Barnabas were right. And the apostles in Jerusalem wrote a letter to the Gentile churches telling them that Paul was right, and gave that and recommended Paul to them. So, I mean, I'm not sure why this man, this podcaster, thinks he knows more about Paul and his agreements or disagreements with the apostles than they knew. They certainly were on his side. They recommended him. So I think this guy's off the wall. Now there were always people questioning Paul's apostleship. Much of what he wrote to the Corinthians, especially in 2 Corinthians, is a defense of his own apostleship against people who said he's not a real apostle. But the people who were saying it weren't real apostles either. They weren't. They were Greeks. I mean, they lived far away from the apostles in Jerusalem. They just didn't like Paul, and they wanted to live differently than Paul preached. Now, today, and maybe forever, there have been people who have had a hard time seeing that Paul's teaching in his letters is the same as Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. And the reason for that is that Paul has been, especially since the Reformation, represented as if he was against good works. This was the big controversy in the Reformation. The Reformers thought that the Catholic Church was emphasizing good works too much. And the Reformers were saying, no, we're saved by grace without works. And that became such a controversy that the two ideas of faith and works got polarized by the two sides. And therefore, Luther and the other guys claimed Paul, especially the book of Romans and such, as the basis for their beliefs. And the Catholics, they didn't have any problem with Paul either, but they didn't see him contradicting Jesus, and I don't either. I actually have a document which you can find online if you go to Matthew 7:13, 713.com, Matthew 713.com. There's a lot of resources there. One of them, you can find a thing where it says, I think it may be under articles, or it might be under charts. But I have there a chart comparing the teachings of Jesus and Paul in two columns. And I select the 15 primary teachings of Jesus everything that's not in this group is pretty minor. But the major teachings of Christ, 15 major teachings of Christ are in the left column, and the references and the scriptures are there where Jesus taught them. In the right column, we have Paul teaching the very same 15 things. And it quotes the scripture for that. In other words, you're not going to find any significant difference between Jesus and Paul. Did you look it up? Where is it? My wife is looking it up so I can give you more. Under charts and tables. Yeah. Jesus and Paul is the file. If you go to Matthew 7:13 and click on the thing that says charts and tables, that's where you'll find it. And you'll find there's not a dime's worth of difference between what Jesus preached and what Paul preached. And what Jesus preached is what the other apostles preached, unless they were apostate, since Jesus told them to teach all things that he had commanded. And that's what Paul taught also. Now, it's true that Paul was writing to Gentiles, and Jesus had never addressed Gentiles. So there were some issues among the Gentiles that Jesus never addressed because his audience were all Jews. And Paul doesn't contradict Jesus or doesn't disagree with Jesus, but he has to apply the principles that Jesus taught to new situations which were faced in the Gentile world. For example, the problem of idolatry, which was huge everywhere except in Israel. And so the Gentiles had to, they were coming out of idolatry. They had to decide whether it's okay to eat meat that was sold in the marketplace that was a remnant of an animal that had been sacrificed to idols, those kinds of things. Jesus never even addressed them because the Jews, where Jesus preached in Jerusalem, in Israel, they didn't have that issue. There were no idols there. And so Paul did, and also the fornication issue. Jesus only mentioned fornication one time in his teaching, but he was against it. But Paul mentions fornication in about half a dozen of his letters and really rails on it because fornication was a big thing in the pagan world. It was not a big thing in the Jewish world. That is to say, the Jewish people were living more or less morally. The Gentiles were not. And so Paul, of course, really emphasizes a lot of things Jesus never really said much about, because Paul's talking to people in a different culture, but he's not teaching a different set of values or rules. So anyway, this fellow you're listening to, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Paul and Jesus taught exactly the same thing. The other apostles, though initially when he was first converted, they didn't know him, and they knew he'd been an enemy. Yeah, they didn't trust him at first, but then he won them over. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you 3 reasons why they became convinced that he was the real deal. One, as I mentioned, his conversion resulted in him having the same power to work miracles that they had. Now, if he had faked his conversion, well, that'd be one thing, but how would he fake these miracles? I mean, he wasn't a magician. He was a Pharisee. The Jews hated magic, and he would hate it too. He didn't work any magic, but he did the same kind of miracles Jesus did and the apostles did. That kind of, Paul says to the Corinthians when he's defending his apostleship to them in 2 Corinthians 12:12, he says, surely the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience and signs and wonders. That is, through his ministry, he worked signs and wonders, which he said were the signs of apostleship. So that's the first reason, or one of the 3 reasons that the apostles accepted him eventually. Another was that his character was ideal. He lived a holy life. He was not into money. He was not into sex. He was not into fame. By the way, those are the things that lead false teachers and false ministers to go astray. Loving money, loving sex, and loving fame. Paul was not into any of that stuff. And they knew it. And Paul didn't travel alone most of the time. He usually had a handful of young godly men with him who were keeping him accountable. He could say to Timothy, who had traveled with him for a couple of years or more, he could say, Timothy, I've set an example for you of how to live a pure life. Just do as you've seen me do. I mean, Paul didn't live like a fake Christian at all, and he did these miracles. But also, the third thing was that he risked his life every day, because the Pharisees, or not the Pharisees so much as the Sanhedrin, were continually stirring up people to kill him. And then the pagans didn't like him either, because he was speaking things they thought were against Caesar. And so he went to jail. He got beaten. He was stoned to death once, or to the edge of death. He either rose from the dead or recovered. It's not entirely clear, but the point is, he spent a lot of time in jail, took a lot of beatings. Eventually, he lived in poverty. He was naked, he said, and hungry most of the time, because he was traveling among enemies and so forth, and spent a lot of his time in jail. And then, of course, he was beheaded for his faith. Now, that's not the kind of life a person lives if they're trying to get some kind of power, some kind of money, some kind of comfort out of the ministry. The man had everything about him, spoke of his genuineness. And then, of course, his teaching was the same as that of Jesus. So anyone who says his letters don't belong there, well, they're going to have to take that up with Jesus, who called him to be an apostle. And by the way, Jesus said in John 13:20, whoever receives him that I send receives me. Now, the word apostle means one is sent. If you receive one of my apostles, you're receiving me, Jesus said. So we really can't reject Paul without rejecting Christ. And then you've got Peter recommending him, the Jerusalem Council, all the apostles recommending him. But where's this guy get off in the year 2025 saying, yeah, but all those guys were wrong. Jesus was wrong about Paul. The apostles were wrong. Now we need to get his letters out of there. Well, why don't we just get this guy, out of there? Why don't we just say, who are you that we should listen to you? You know nothing. And but it is a popular cultic thing. It's a very heretical cultic thing that's around. You'll find it throughout the internet. People saying Paul was a false apostle. A lot of times it's the Hebrew roots people, or it's the Jewish roots people. They don't like Paul because Paul said we're not under the law, and the Jewish roots people want to believe that we are. And they're usually
they don't like Galatians very much.
No, they do not. They do not. Anyway, we've talked a long time, Mike. I'm going to have to move on to another call, but great talking to you.
Okay, I appreciate it. I'm going to share this with them. Thank you.
Okay, great. God bless you, man.